Ian Toll is the author of Six Frigates. That was his first book, which won the 2007 Samuel Eliot Morison Award, which is the highest award that a naval historian can aspire to, and well earned. And now, as you've seen, he is the producer of a landmark trilogy on the Pacific War, which he's going to be telling us about tonight. He has spoken to numerous TV shows. He's been published in every magazine, plus several others that I have been published in, widely seen on TV and commentating for the Naval War College as well. My understanding is from last night's conversation, however, that he may be heading into the world of fiction and leaving history behind. And having slaved for 12 years over my latest book, I can sort of understand why he might want to be doing that. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Ian Toll.
Thank you very much, John. That was a very generous introduction. I appreciate it. As he said, I came at this project back in 2007. I'd just written my first book, Six Frigates. And I had this idea that I would write a new history of the Pacific War, which is a kind of a bold idea in the first place because, of course, every aspect of World War II has been thoroughly covered. But then I had the idea that I would do it in one volume, which seems absolutely nuts in retrospect. And I got a contract from my first publisher, and I had a deadline that was about 3 years out. And 2.5 years in, I'd written 800 pages, and that was good. The specified length of the manuscript was about 500, so I was over the length. But the story had advanced through the Battle of Midway, which, as many of you know, is 6 months into a war that lasted 44 months. So this was an emergency situation, and I called my editor and I came clean. I was afraid he would declare that he was canceling the contract. But instead, he agreed to turn it into a trilogy. And so a project that I had expected to spend 4, maybe 5 years on, I ended up spending 12 years on and ended up with 3 books. Even so, the third book ended up being the longest of the 3. And there were times when I wondered if maybe I ought to call him again and see if we could turn it into a 4-book series or a 5-book series. Douglas Adams, who wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Trilogy, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, started out with the idea of writing a trilogy. He wrote 3 of those books. And then he wrote a 4th. The subtitle of that was the 4th book in the inaccurately named Hitchhiker's Trilogy. And then he wrote a 5th, and the subtitle of the 5th was even better. The 5th book in the increasingly inaccurately named Hitchhiker's Trilogy. So why this big project, this 3-volume history of the Pacific War, coming some 75 years after the war had been waged, to join what is, I think, one way to say it is it's a crowded literature. Another more polite way to say it would be that it's a mature literature. Well, there are a lot of different ways to answer that, but one way is to say we're still seeing new books written about the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Spartans held off the Persians in a famous battle 2,500 years ago. New books will be written about World War II 1,000 years from now, if we're so lucky to be here. And some of those books will be worth reading. There is a vast amount of data on this war. Much of it has really never been mined. And as large as the World War II literature is, it is strikingly lopsided. Certain aspects of the great conflict have been worked over to the point of exhaustion, while others have been surprisingly neglected. The Pacific War has always been, in a sort of a strange way, given its size, a forgotten war, a neglected war, a war fought in the shadow of the war against Hitler in Europe. We talk about World War II in terms of theaters. Really, the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific were separate wars, fought against different enemies, and fought simultaneously. But really, they need to be understood as separate conflicts. And someone could write 10 books on the war in Europe, and you would call that person a World War II expert. And it would be fair to call that person a World War II expert. And yet that person might know little or nothing about what happened in the Pacific. And the reverse is true as well. Within the Pacific, we've had this second, what I would call a bias almost. We've tended to think about the war in Europe as a series of island battles. And what really happened in the Pacific was that we confronted on December 7th, 1941, an emergency in which our main fleet of battleships had been knocked out of action entirely. And we had a Japanese Navy, which was at that time, in some ways, the most formidable Navy in the world, with free run of the Pacific. Destroying the Japanese fleet was the principal strategic problem that we faced in the aftermath of the strike on Pearl. And that, I believe, is the story at the heart of the broader story of the Pacific War. And so I have worked in writing this trilogy in the spirit that you should place the naval campaign at the heart of the narrative, but to tell the whole story around it. And this requires a kind of an inversion of thinking. We're a continental people. We're different from the British. We're different from the Japanese in this respect. It's not natural for us to think of naval warfare as being the primary kind of warfare, the main plot. For those island peoples, I think that comes more naturally. For hundreds of years, the British have thought of their Royal Navy as being the principal arm of their national defense. The Japanese adopted that way of thinking as well. For us, from the very beginning, our American Revolution, it's the Army. The Army is the heart of our national defense. It's the oldest service. It's the first service, the service with the greatest claim to do the lion's share of the work of defending this country. Naval operations, air operations, these are supporting operations. When you come to the Pacific, you have to begin by inverting that kind of thinking. Think of the Pacific first as a sea war, in which fighting on land and air operations were the supporting operations. The primary driving part of this war is the sea war, and I've worked in that spirit. We have a series of bloody island battles fought in strange and exotic places in the Pacific, places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And then you have MacArthur, of course, looming very large, the most famous at the time, most revered military leader, not just in the Pacific, but anywhere in the world, American leader. He returns to the Philippines, making good his promise. And then we have the atomic bombs, and then we have the surrender. The naval war is something of a black box, I think, in the popular recollection of the war. We know that, and again, I'm talking about a popular impression here. We understand that the Battle of Midway was particularly important. Many, many people I talk to who don't know much about the Pacific War will say, well, we got them at Midway. We did something important at Midway. And then after that, the naval war was essentially as good as won. Well, the Battle of Midway, as John Parshall will tell you, and he knows it better than anyone else, and I think has brought a lot of attention to this battle, was an immensely important battle. We sunk 4 of Japan's first-line aircraft carriers with all of their airplanes, and we did this just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It was a devastating counterpunch, but it happened toward the beginning of the war. And even after Midway, the Japanese still were able to match us in most categories of deployed naval strength. The struggle to overcome Japan's power at sea would last for years after Midway. And Midway, as important as it is, it's typical of the naval battles of that war in that it's difficult to visualize, isn't it? It's a carrier air war. It's a battle in which you have airplanes from contending fleets of aircraft carriers attacking the ships of the enemy over the horizon. The crews of the ships are not coming into direct sight of the enemy ships, and that was typical of many of the most important battles of this war. These battles are spread out. They're complicated. They take place over a period of many, many hours, in some cases many, many days. Even at the time, the commanding officers at the top of these fleets, they don't really understand what's happening. They're feeling their way through the fog of war. And it's taken decades for historians to piece together what actually happened. In many cases, Midway's a good example. There were important parts of that story that were not well understood for 30 or 40 years after the battle had been fought. And so it's difficult to visualize what happened. It's in the nature of naval war that you can't visit the battlefields, or you can, but you'll just see a ceaseless, unchanging blue seascape. There are no monuments. And I think that also contributes to this kind of this zone of forgetfulness that surrounds the naval war. The submarine campaign in the Pacific was the most complete example in history of the way in which a fleet of submarines can be deployed to destroy an enemy's overseas shipping links and to essentially knock out the economic supports of his war effort. And yet the Battle of the Atlantic, in which the Germans tried and ultimately failed to do what we did do in the Pacific, holds a much greater purchase on the popular imagination. I think in part it's an issue of popular culture. There have been no outstanding films on the naval war in the Pacific. There have been a number of films, and I know that many of you are thinking of some of them right now. But I would say that there hasn't been a single movie like Saving Private Ryan, for example, that has kind of altered our public perceptions of this conflict. And of course, the Nazis are endlessly fascinating, a regime unique in history that in many ways represents a kind of distillation of evil in our memories. The Japanese militarist regime, by contrast, has been poorly understood, I think it's fair to say. And in this country in particular, as in actually many other nations in Asia, we took with us this sort of searing hatred of the Japanese because of the way they had conducted themselves. But that hatred and the memory of that hatred, which has in some ways lasted even to the present, I think has in times obscured our ability to look clearly at what was happening in Japan. There's the language barrier, the cultural barrier. Until recently, the odd dynamics of that regime, how it functioned, how it made decisions, the role of the emperor, all of these things were poorly understood. And that is, I think, a fruitful area for future scholarship. Both scholarship in Japan, which has been limited, I think, by the culture and by an inability to kind of do the important work of reconstructing that period objectively, and also a work for Western scholars of Japan. Even those who have researched and written about the Pacific War for decades, and this is an example of what I'm talking about, are surprised to learn that Japanese military forces actually behaved with great discipline and even chivalry in the wars that preceded the Second World War. In their operations during the Boxer Rebellion, when they operated alongside the troops of many Western nations in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and in the First World War, in which the Japanese admittedly had a limited role. But in each of these conflicts, the behavior of Japanese troops on the battlefield was with the witness of Western observers, journalists, in some cases Red Cross representatives. It was clearly documented that the Japanese forces were disciplined. They were scrupulous in the way that they treated their prisoners of war. And in many cases, as in the Russo-Japanese War, for example, civilians in the battle zones had reason to be more fearful of the Russians than of the Japanese. For reasons that are still debated by scholars, there was this sudden turn toward a much more barbarous culture that occurred in the late 20s and the 1930s, so that by the early 1930s, the behavior of Japanese forces in Shanghai, for example, was already attracting international notoriety. And by the Second World War, something had happened, and they were behaving very differently. So for a combination of reasons, for the reasons that I've been talking about, for the kind of singular fame and popularity of Douglas MacArthur, who loomed so large as a figure, who monopolized so much of the public relations and the press coverage that Americans were seeing at home of this conflict. The greater attention then and since to the war in Europe over the war in the Pacific, the island campaign over the naval campaign, produces the perverse result that the naval war in the Pacific, which was by an enormous margin the largest naval war ever waged, remains somewhat obscure in our history. The Pacific War was the only naval war that has ever been waged across the entire breadth and length of the Pacific, an ocean so large that you could fit all of the world's land masses into it and still have room to spare. It was the largest amphibious war in history. Amphibious war, this specialized kind of warfare where you strike an enemy on land, but you do it by way of sea. It was the largest, the bloodiest, the most technically difficult amphibious war in history. An amphibious war, by its very nature, forces the different services, the different arms of the military to work together. The Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Forces, all of the logistical and support forces are forced in amphibious war like that of the Pacific to work together in sustained and intricate cooperation, something that challenged the American military because our services really had not been accustomed to working together. In fact, they had existed largely apart from one another, with almost no coordination in their planning, in their training, in their weapons acquisition, and the developments of their various doctrines. And so the emergency that was imposed by the sudden Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 forced our military services very, very quickly to find a way to begin working together effectively. And that is a theme that I think is right at the heart of this story, and one that I've used to try to, as a template, to try to tell each part of this conflict that unfolded over a little less than 4 years. In Japan, too, the rivalry between the Army and the Navy is at the heart of the decision to go to war in some fairly interesting and subtle ways. The Army and the Navy had regarded one another in Japan virtually as enemies, certainly as rivals. And it was a military-dominated society, which means not only that the military has the power to direct the fate of the country, but also that the Army and the Navy were directly involved in the civilian administration of the state. And so when you look at Army and Navy leaders in Japan, this is a subtle point, but one that's often missed. is that you don't evaluate them necessarily the same way you would evaluate the careers of military leaders in a country like the United States. These were the leading politicians of their day. And so someone like Isoroku Yamamoto, most famous for having planned, insisted upon, carried out the strike on Pearl Harbor, and then in addition insisted upon the disastrous attempt to take Midway and to try to flush the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor, resulting in one of the great defeats in naval history. Isoroku Yamamoto is remembered in Japan not so much for his role as an admiral in that war, but for the influence that he had as a political leader in Japan prior to the war. And he was opposed to the decision to wage war on the United States. He risked his life in arguing against that decision. And in a sense, the defeat of Japan vindicated him in his death. Certain very conservative ideas have governed the way that history is written. I remember a review of my first book, Six Frigates, and I don't remember where it ran exactly. And the review was mostly positive about the book, but the reviewer sounded one note of criticism. He said that I had a bad habit of straying out of my lane. And I absolutely loved that review, because the moment I read that line, I thought, yes, this is what those who write military history should think about doing more of. We should get out of this idea of staying in your lane. We should tell these stories in a way that embraces the larger themes and takes account of what's happening throughout the societies as these conflicts are waged. So I have to plead guilty. I do stray out of my lane. I do it quite a bit. I like to do it, and I intend to keep doing it. I believe military history, and I think especially naval history, has suffered from this stay-in-your-lane syndrome. Naval history, I think, is too important to be left to those who have traditionally called themselves naval historians. And I don't want to start any feuds with any academic historians, but in all candor, I do believe the following, that historically, naval history has been the province of specialists who have drawn their mandate very narrowly to write about naval strategy, operations, tactics. Much of naval history has been written in the past, not so much in the present. I think this has changed, but in the past, naval history has been written by scholars who are directly affiliated with the Navy, in some cases employed by the US Navy. I think there's power in approaching a subject from the outside. I have only the greatest respect for this institution, but I am in no way beholden to it, and I won't ever hesitate to puncture some of its myths. Academic history is generally written in the form of an argument. You state a thesis, you marshal evidence, archival evidence to support the thesis, and then you restate the argument, the thesis, in light of the evidence that you have marshaled. Now, of course, this is a very powerful way to get to the bottom of things and to change people's minds about history. It is not the only way to write history. Narrative history is concerned first with telling the story of what happened, and then to develop arguments and themes that you weave into the fabric of a narrative that is principally, first of all, a storytelling narrative. Some of the best history I have read borrows from the storytelling techniques of novelists, or dare I say it, even filmmakers. There are many different elements to this, but above all, I think the objective is to keep the reader in the moment, to impart to the reader a sense of what it was like to be there at the time, to be in the room where the decisions are made, to be on the deck of the ship as the battle was fought, to be in the cockpit, to be in the foxhole, to see events through the eyes of those who saw them and to feel what they felt at the time, to reconstruct the mental processes. And of course, this is more than just storytelling. It's more than just a kind of a highfalutin form of entertainment. By bringing the reader closer to those who experience these events in the moment, of course, you're allowing the reader to understand better the context in which major decisions were made. And so there is, in the narrative history approach, there is something about getting to the truth as well that may be missing from the more academic structure of history. Narrative history, admittedly, has some significant weaknesses as well as a form. And I think, most importantly, narrative history, storytelling history, it tends to stumble over complexity. And there's a lot of complexity in history. The storyteller would like to pretend that things are less complex than they are, and perhaps to gloss over complexity in a way that ultimately does real damage to the reader's ability to understand what's happening. And in the worst cases, I think popular or narrative historians and biographers will do that. They'll write with a kind of insouciance to pretend that complexity and nuance did not exist, or that it can be sort of dismissed rather than confronted directly. And I'm thinking specifically about some of the most renowned, the most decorated historians and biographers. I have found that these are inherent problems with the form, but they are manageable. They're manageable problems. You can fold arguments into the narrative. You can nod in the direction of complexity or nuance without going on at excessive length about it. The approach that I have taken is a kind of an episodic or discursive narrative, which is really a series of deep dives. So rather than flying over the landscape at medium altitude, I think more in terms of shifting altitude frequently, flying at 30,000 feet, diving down, flying at 4,000 feet, and then going back up again. That's the metaphor I always thought about as I was trying to structure these narratives. Show the reader the landscape from high altitude, take the reader down where you can see detail on the ground. But as I've thought about it, I actually prefer a different metaphor. Think about what you do when you walk into a room where there's a complex three-dimensional object, say at a sculpture gallery. There's a piece of abstract sculpture. How do you take that in? Well, you step back, right? You look at it. You look at the shape. You walk around it. You look at it from different angles. You walk in close and you look at the detail on the surface of the object. And there's no reason a historical narrative can't do the same thing that you would do in that sculpture gallery. Constantly look at the subject from different angles, shift those angles, come in close, step back and look at the whole shape. And so that's what I try to do. Teddy Roosevelt was, among many other things, no slouch as a historian or a biographer. He wrote some of the best histories and biographies of his day. He was a really gifted narrative nonfiction writer. He wrote what is in some ways still the best single-volume history of the Naval War of 1812, called the Naval War of 1812. And I don't know how he did this. I would love to look at a scan of his brain or something. He was just not an ordinary person. He was 22 years old, and he was enrolled at Columbia Law School and had a full load of classes. And he researched this book by reading all of the original captain's letters to the Secretary of the Navy, all of the British officers' action reports as well, sifting through them very carefully, figuring out through detailed diagrams, which he drew himself, exactly what had happened in each of these ship battles, and then writing a history which effectively rebutted many of the British historians, and he did all of this, as I said, at the ripe age of 22 while carrying a full load of classes at Columbia Law School. Well, Roosevelt, among the many other great books that he wrote, He once told a lecture hall full of historians, the American Society of Historians, that he thought perhaps the single most important trait for a historian was imagination. Imagination, he said, was the single most important trait. I would have loved to be there so I could just look at the expressions on the faces of all of these august historians when this, who was by this time the ex-president of the United States, told them this. It's a controversial idea, isn't it? Imagination for a historian, someone writing nonfiction, someone who is chronicling and documenting the past. You would think someone like that is supposed to keep their imagination in check. You don't want your imagination to take over when you're charged with reporting and analyzing the facts as you found them in your research. You would think that any historian should keep his imagination on a very short leash. But I think TR was onto something, because no matter how thorough your research, how impeccable your sourcing, it takes a feat of imagination to place yourself into the shoes, into the skin of those who lived in the past. To place yourself into a different time in history, and to do this, this thing which I think is difficult, which is to forget everything you know about what happened after the point in history that you're documenting at any one moment. Characters in history could not see into the future. It seems very trite to say that. It seems blindingly obvious, doesn't it? But you have to remind yourself constantly as you're doing this, not to take into account all of the things that you know happened after that point in time. In the realm of military history, I think this is especially important. It's especially important to keep this point in front of you. Commanders on the ground, in the air, at sea, they were feeling their way through a fog of war. And they were making decisions with imperfect information, in many cases upon mistaken information. The historian's mandate, part of the historian's mandate, of course, is to dispel that fog and to explain exactly what was happening at any given moment. At the same time, you have to allow yourself to live in that fog as well. The very act of dispelling the fog of war through our marshaling of evidence and our analysis of events presents a dilemma, because in a very literal sense, while assessing those moment-to-moment action, those points of action, those developments, those decisions, we know more than they do, and we must always remind ourselves of that. I think about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the largest naval battle in history. This was a battle fought during our return to the Philippines. It was an immensely confused battle taking place across an immense theater of operations, essentially all around the Philippines over a 3-day period. And as I document what happened in that battle, I'm constantly reminded that at any one moment, I know more. I know more than the American commanders. I know more than the Japanese commanders. I know more than Admiral Halsey, more than Admiral Ozawa, more than Admiral Kurita, more than Admiral Kincaid. I know more because I have the benefit of 75 years of history and hindsight and the work of historians who came before me, and the ability to read the dispatches and to untangle what was happening moment by moment. None of them had any of that. And so for me to explain what's happening, I need to use that knowledge that I have. At the same time, I need to forget it so that I can place myself into the shoes of those who are making these immensely important life and death decisions under great pressure. And of course, as I said, all of this is very intuitive, perhaps even obvious, when you lay it out the way I've laid it out here. But I think many historians and writers find it difficult to perform these kinds of mental gymnastics. So when TR says that imagination is an important trait for historians, I think maybe that was what he was getting at. This ability to simultaneously use the knowledge that you have with power of retrospect. at the same time to forget it. So I think a little bit that's what TR meant. I want to leave time for questions and discussion, but I'll just close with this thought. War is a force that has shaped our history, all of history. War is a test. The title of the first volume is Pacific Crucible. Crucible is a kind of test. We were tested in December 1941 when the Japanese attacked us very suddenly and in a very devastating way. A test is like a kind of stress test. In the same way that an engineer will place a material under stress. Why does an engineer stress test something? Because you get information about it that you can't get otherwise. War is a test of nations. It's a test of systems of government, of entire peoples, of societies, of cultures, of military organizations, and of individuals. You place something under stress, you find out more about its underlying nature. War is like the stress test in history. It's unique in that way. Perhaps not unique. There are, of course, other kinds of tests. We've gone through one with this pandemic. But a crisis, war, I think, is the best example. A crisis is like a test in the timeline of history that teaches you something that you wouldn't have learned otherwise. That, I think, is the best argument for studying war, for studying military history. And one of the reasons I think it's really a shame that in the academy, among professional historians at many universities, the study of war is really out of vogue. And there are many, even leading universities in the country, in which you have departments of history staffed with eminent historians, none of whom have ever studied military history or the history of war. I wrote much of this trilogy while living in San Francisco, and right near where I lived in the marina, right on the San Francisco side of the Golden Gate Bridge, there was a public exhibition of a girder of the type used to build the bridge. And this girder had been taken to the Berkeley College of Engineering, and these Berkeley engineers had put it into this immense machine that placed some enormous amount of weight on this girder. And I don't want to say how much because I don't remember. But this girder had bent, and it hadn't broken. And the point, of course, was that the Golden Gate Bridge is engineered to withstand an absolutely enormous earthquake, an earthquake of more than 9 on the Richter scale. They're confident that that building will stand because of that kind of stress testing. This is what happened to this country in World War II. It bent, but it didn't break. And so I'll stop there. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from New York City, once again, let's hear it up for Mr. Ian Tolan, a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. All right, now the kind of the fun portion of the evening, we'll have Ian join the team up here as well. I'd like to introduce our 2 special veterans that both served in the Pacific in the United States Navy, very proudly in the United States Navy. In the middle here, with in the beige in the center, to the left of Henry over here, I'd like to introduce Mr. James McDougall. And Jim, is that handsome devil up there, was an aircraft ordnance man or an ordnance mate, first class, in VPB, Patrol Bomber 52, better known as the Black Cats. They sleep by day and they prowl by night, and that's the reason why they were named for that. Jim was born in Lamars, Iowa, and on December 7th, when Jim heard the news about Pearl Harbor, he was washing his hair, and he was cleaning up for the day, and he heard about Pearl Harbor and the shock of it. And just 7 months after he graduated from high school, he enlisted in the Iowa Guard, and at 19 years old, he volunteered to join the United States Navy. He was trained at Great Lakes Naval Training Camp, also at Camp Dewey in Wilmington, Tennessee, and then took gunnery training at Hollywood, Florida, and then thus went abroad. Oops, I'm sorry. There we go. Thus went abroad to Australia, where he joined the squadron. And we'll find out a little bit more about Jim's escapades in the Pacific. But before we do that, I would like to introduce the gentleman on his left. This is Henry Gagner, who was born in Mentor, Minnesota. Henry was raised in a farm family, a very, very tough and hardworking family. And Henry was in high school when on December 7th, when the Japanese attacked in Pearl Harbor. And so he enlisted and also was trained at Great Lakes Naval Air Service in Illinois, and then eventually made it to Camp Shoemaker in California. And he will also tell us his escapades in the Pacific. And Henry was assigned as a communications specialist aboard the USS Wright, and was involved in the Leyte Gulf campaign, as was Jim, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But before we do it, let's welcome our two veterans to the stage. Right? That's it. So I'm just going to kind of go back and forth here with the two gentlemen, and I will we'll field some questions at the end here. But the first question goes out to Jim, and let me just advance here a little bit forward. You can see what a handsome devil he was, and this was Jim's office. That was the blister in a PBY Catalina, actually a PBY 5 Catalina. And this was the side blister where Jim spent much of his time in Patrol Bombing Squadron 52. This was a photo that was taken of him by an Australian magazine called Yank Down Under, and gave a little caption of this young lad from Lamar's, Iowa, hanging out the side of the blister of a PBY Catalina. Also, the Catalina in that form was equipped with a .30 caliber machine gun, a flexible machine gun mount, which Jim was responsible for manning. And this is the airplane that Jim flew on. This is a PBY Catalina, and there's an old saying. The Catalina at the onset of the war was kind of outdated. There was an old saying that it took off at 100 miles an hour, it flew at 100 miles an hour, and it landed at 100 miles an hour. And so, but I'll tell you, it was a workhorse in the Pacific, and the countless lives that it saved. Jim will tell us here a little bit about that. But just to give you an idea, the Black Cats had their airplanes completely painted black. They were painted flat black, and here we see a crewman obviously servicing the aircraft before a mission, and you can kind of get an idea. One of the things of note is that you can see the twin .50 caliber machine guns that were operated by the pilot. They could fire those machine guns, and those were mounted in the nose of the PBY. And then lastly, this is a squadron of the Black Cats in formation over the jungles of the South Pacific. So let's ask Jim about the PBY. Describe, as I mentioned, you operated, and I shall say this, you operated, you were kind of on the night shift, so to speak, weren't you? And Jim was kind enough to bring a visual aid, as you can see up here, a model of the PBY. And we had an interesting conversation because I think everybody's familiar with the high altitude bombing campaign, say, in Europe with the 8th and the 15th Air Force, bombing from altitudes, or precision bombing from altitudes of, say, 25,000 to up to 35,000 feet in altitude. But that wasn't the case for you, Jim, right?
In Europe, they were using Flying Fortress and dropping from approximately 30 to 40,000 feet in the air. And when you compare what we were doing to that, it's totally different. What we were doing was taking off, and we flew every third night, but we would take off at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, we would fly approximately 350 miles up to the Bismarck Archipelago, which is an area where the Japanese were almost compelled to run their supply lines in order to get it to Rabaul. When the supplies got to Rabaul, they would take them out to these various islands that they had captured at the beginning of the war to supply their troops out there. We would take off in the evening, like I say, about 6 o'clock, and fly up there, fly through a strait between New Britain and New Ireland called St. George Channel. And then we were in the Bismarck Archipelago. In the Bismarck Archipelago, we used our radar. We had search radar and homing radar. Also, we had the assistance of the Navy, who had broken the Japanese supply information radio system that they communicated with. They would give us the information on any ships that they thought would be in that area. So we would go up, use our radar system, which was search and homing. We would put it on search until we found this blip. We would then turn the aircraft towards the blip and just fly until we could see the wake of that vessel, and then we would fly down about mast height and drop 4 bombs. The bombs were carried underneath the wings. There were 500, 1,000, 1,500 in bomb racks underneath the wing. We had the ability with the intervalometer to drop the bomb in the order that we wanted to and the distance that we wanted to. So when we dropped, we would drop the 500 first on the left, the heavy bomb on the right, then over to the heavy bomb on the left, and back over to the light bomb on the right, which was a 500-pound bomb. These bombs were unique in the fact that they had a fuse, which after it hit a ship, would take 4 seconds before it would go off. And generally that allowed it time to go through the deck down to the bottom of the ship, where it would go off and do the most damage. After we had dropped our bombs, I have seen the first ship that we hit was a freighter, about 8,000-ton freighter, and those bombs had gone down and blown the bottom of that ship out, and it went down within about 5 minutes, and we watched as the ship went down. We circled, and then when the bombs were gone, we headed back home. But normally, if we did not see any ships, we would return about approximately 8 o'clock in the morning.
Henry, as I mentioned, you went through Camp Schumacher in California, and then you went on a troop transport ship, and you left on the 4th of July, 1944, heading westward on the USS Howell with about 7,000 additional troops. And tell us about that wonderful cruise. I mean, you had maid service and a comfortable bed, and no, seriously, tell us about that voyage.
Oh, that was a good trip. Anyway, we left on the 4th of July, and I remember crossing underneath the bridge, and we were heading west. And there was a blimp that was over our heads and helped us out for about 3 days, but it wasn't very far out. We weren't very far out when I got kind of sick to my stomach, and I kind of stayed close to my quarters and stuff like that. And so we were gone about 3 days. And then this blimp kind of went back home, back to the shore. But we were on our way over to where we were going to go. We were zigzagging back and forth so that nobody, we were trying to avoid anything that was trying to follow us. And we were on the water for 22 days, and we landed on New Caledonia. The French Free Island out there, not too far from Australia. Then we debarked there, and we were there about a week, and then we just kind of like just waited to see what was going to happen to us. Anyway, after we'd been there for about a week, we got on. There was some LCIs. They were landing infantry, and they were, now they were all getting ready for that invasion of Leyte. And anyway, they got us on there, and they shipped us across to some of the islands where we were supposed to be replacements. And a lot of places we were just not equipped to be, very good, because I just had gotten out of high school and didn't know anything. I mean, and so what are they going to do with somebody that doesn't know anything? But anyway, we got off a couple of islands, and we were there a few days, and they'd scared us out of there. They'd sent us back on that. They'd say, "We don't need you here. You just keep on going." And we must have done that for about 5 or 6 islands. And the last island, they finally, we were there about, like I say, 3 or 4 days, and they said, get all your stuff, all your gear, and meet us, get to the airport. There was kind of a makeshift airport. It wasn't exactly an airport, it was just a strip that they had carved out of the coral. And anyway, after about a couple of days, a plane came in. It was a C-47 plane. They flew us to Townsville, Australia. And we stayed there. It was an army camp there. We stayed there for a little bit. And then I think after a day or two, they flew us to Brisbane. And then when we got there, that's where we eventually boarded the ship I was assigned to.
Let's leave it right there, Henry, and we'll come back to that. We'll pick up the story, but let's turn it back to Jim here.
Okay.
One of the fascinating stories he told me about was there was quite a character in Patrol Bombing Squadron 52, and this is the gentleman that's pictured on the screen by the name of Bill, I'm going to say this right, Lahodny, right?
Lahodny.
Yep, Lahodny. So Bill was I guess, an adventurous man, kind of a person to come up with new ideas, and he thought that it would be a fantastic idea to take a 75 millimeter cannon that you can see in the picture. This so happens to be on a B25 Mitchell, and you can see in that lower diagram how large that cannon is, and put that into a PBY Catalina. I'm going to let Jim tell about that.
We were operating with the 5th Air Force, and they were using B-25s, which had a cannon mounted in the nose. And Hodney discovered that, and it really fascinated him. And he came back from this meeting with the 5th Air Force guys, and he said, you know, we ought to do that with a PBY. And he, I think, visualized, you know, of using it like a fighter pilot when he would come down and aim the plane at what he wanted to shoot at. And the idea was something that he really relished. So we had an old relic there, and on the beach at Palm Island. It's one of the places we were at when we were trying to go up north. And so they got a 75 millimeter, and the guys mounted it in the nose of the relic. So it was quite a deal when the day came when it was completed in there and they were going to fire it. So they fired the 75 millimeter cannon, and it went right out through the tail of the plane.
I'm going to move forward to Henry again, and so he's in Australia. He's had a luxurious 22-day trip across the Blue Pacific, and he is finally assigned. Well, I'll give it away. He said that he didn't know anything. Well, actually, he did. Henry was discovered, knew how to type, and was a very good typist. And so they needed typists, and so he was assigned to this beautiful ship, the USS Wright, which is named in honor of the Wright brothers. And if you look at the caption, I think below that, you can see it scribbled. I think this photo was taken in the mid 1920s. So the ship was very dated. Oh, it had air conditioning and all that stuff, right, Henry? It was just a luxurious place to live, right? So your assignment, Henry, as a communications specialist, tell the folks kind of what you did aboard the USS Wright.
Everything during the war was coded and decoded, of course, so that nobody could find out what we were doing and what we were talking about. That was my job that I was assigned to, because like Mark said, I had learned to type 1 year when I was a sophomore, and I had forgotten a lot about typing anyway. But you go out and you do it 8 hours a day for maybe 12 hours a day for a while. You either learn it or you don't. But
that's right.
Anyway, I got better at it, and we continued doing that until the war was ended.
Well, he downplays in a very modest fashion. Let's think about that. As Ian said, put the place and time and the messages that came across to Henry. You might be very modest in your actions, but what you did to code and decode messages, probably some of those messages changed the course of the war, Henry.
Yeah,
so it's
so.
Don't be so modest.
Well, I hope that's true.
It's true. And this one goes out to Connie Harris in our drive over here tonight. And the skillfully written round tablet that I hope you picked up, and if you haven't, there's a copies available about the ready availability to the U.S. Navy and to so, in the Pacific and so forth, was ice cream. I mean, think about it. What's better than a nice thing of ice cream, and also something to remind them of home? And it was kind of an interesting discussion at lunch today as well. And so on the drive over, I said, Henry, you can answer this. Did the USS Wright have an ice cream maker?
Yes, it did.
So Connie, very, very, very well researched. You're correct. And it was pretty relatively available, wasn't it?
It was one of the best things they had there.
Yes, indeed. Let's go back to October 5th through the 8th of 1944. And as Ian mentioned, Jonathan will certainly agree, and anybody that's studied the Pacific War in great detail, was the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. There was an alteration in plans, and the new battle plan had to be transported, so let's call it everybody was on the same page. Think about this change in tactics in this major battle that they know is coming up. And Jim's aircraft and his crew were assigned to take those change in battle plans and deliver them. Well, you tell the story, Jim, about the plans for the Leyte Gulf.
I was flying with the captain, and any of you familiar know that when there's some exotic flight that comes up, if the pilot is generally, the captain is the one that takes it. And we had been flying cover for ships that were moving in, a convoy that were moving to the west in anticipation of the invasion. And we were told to report to MacArthur's headquarters, which was on a lake right north of Landia, and it was a freshwater lake. We went there, and we found that 17 bags of mail, all of the capital ships in the Third Fleet.
They each got a bag, right?
What's that?
I said they each got a bag.
They each got a bag, which it contained all the changes
Right.
that were made in the plan. The MacArthur thought that they should be invading at that tip of the Philippines, and the Navy decided that that wouldn't be a wise place to make the landing, and they said they should make the landing at Leyte. Therefore, these plans for the invasion were put together at MacArthur's headquarters. MacArthur agreed that possibly this would be a better place.
Right.
So they decided to change, and they called us in to this lake at MacArthur's headquarters, gave us the 17 bags, and we flew out to Palau to give it to the Third Fleet. And on the way out, we had an escort of F-6Fs, and they were not too impressed by our speed.
I'm sure.
And one of the pilots, I think it was probably the captain of the squad flew up next to us and put his canopy back and looked over at us and he went, put his canopy back and went back on.
Thank you, Jim. That's a great story. Very well done. Thank you. So at this point, I think it'd be an opportune time maybe to open up the floor for any questions. Does anybody have any questions to either the vets or to Ian?
There's been books, the German War in particular with Nicholas Stargart, about life inside of Germany for the people who lived there during the war years. You don't hear a lot about what life was like inside of Japan during those years. I wonder if you can, Mr. Toll, if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure, yeah, that is a subject that has always interested me a lot. How was the war experienced by ordinary people in Japan? And fortunately, there's actually a lot available because so many original sources, letters, diaries, oral histories, excerpts from Japanese newspapers. We had a branch of our naval intelligence communications was just hoovering up all of these radio broadcasts, not Radio Tokyo propaganda, English language broadcasts to our troops, but just domestic radio broadcasts. We actually had a department that was recording those things and then providing transcripts. And so all that stuff's at the National Archives. Anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying there are a lot of ways to try to get a sense of what life was like for ordinary Japanese. It's a theme that I go into in significant length in this trilogy. Without going on too long, I would say there are two themes that really stand out. One is deprivation. The population became immiserated. And they were verging really on, they'd been hungry throughout the war. They were verging really on famine toward the end. And one of the interesting counterfactuals is if we hadn't had the atomic bomb, what would have happened? Well, clearly by even late 1945, you would have had famine in urban areas in Japan, which might have led to a destabilization of the regime. So tremendous deprivation for ordinary Japanese. And then the second theme is just the extent to which the Japanese government lied to their own people and insisted on telling them that they were winning when they weren't. Really they had complete control, this regime, of all information sources. It was really the most Orwellian regime, even comparing it to, say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. Total control of information. And the Japanese people didn't really know what was happening. They began to suspect that they might be losing the war, and yet it was a deferential society, and many of them continued to believe that they might actually be able to win. And to a remarkable degree, even right at the end of the war, people were shocked when the emperor said, "We're surrendering," because they did not realize how bad things had gotten. So systematic deceit, keeping the people in the dark, and then that really began to play into the dynamics that the regime, their final decision to surrender, I think, was delayed partly because they feared what would happen if the Japanese people suddenly became aware of the extent to which the military-dominated regime had been lying to them.
Very good. Another question. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, same question, basically. Have you spent a lot of time in Japan researching this book?
Yeah, I did travel in Japan while I was researching the book, and had the chance to meet many of the leading Japanese scholars of the Second World War. Also met a number of their personnel in the Japanese Navy. They're not allowed to call it a Navy. It's a maritime self-defense force. It's the second largest Asian navy now after the Chinese Navy. And I traveled around and saw a number of the sites, a number of the historical sites, and all of that was useful. I also lived in Japan as a child, between the ages of 11 and 14. So in some ways I think of it as a sort of a second home. I'm fond of Japan for that reason. Those ages 11 to 14, those are formative years, when you think about it. And so, but I'm not a Japan scholar. I don't read the language. I don't really speak very much of it, certainly not enough to do an interview. And so I have been forced to rely really on English translated accounts. I acknowledge that's limiting, but the good news is that so much more is available about the Japanese experience of the war, both the military operations and also the political dimension, than was available even, say, 25 years ago. There's much, much more available now. And a lot of very good work has been done, both by Japanese scholars, and their work has been translated, and by Western scholars of Japan.
Very good.
So we're getting there. There's a lot more work to be done, a lot more fruitful scholarship on the subject, which I think will be done.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us here. It's a special night, and we really appreciate you in attendance. So I'll leave it at this, and that's to the, yes, I'll leave it at this in the last thought for the evening. And that's one word that I think can encapsulate evenings like that, and that's the word hero. Anybody catch the game last night with the Red Sox? Kiki Hernandez, it's in the bottom of the ninth. He knocked a sacrifice fly, bringing in, I think it was Danny Santana to win the game, and the Red Sox won. And okay, and they're jumping up and down on each other and all this and that, and they came over, and Kiki Hernandez, I mean, he's a stud. He's an incredible ball player. But what I found that was, I guess, disturbing in a way, was after they'd stopped pouring Gatorade on one another and the celebration had calmed down, they got Kiki Hernandez on camera, and he said all the normal sports cliches and all the rest of it. And they turned it back and said that he really had a heck of a series, and I wish him all the success continuing on. But he said, there he is, Kiki Hernandez, your hero of the game. And I kind of sat there and I went, the heck you mean a hero? A hero? This guy's a multi-million-dollar baseball player that throws a ball, catches a ball, and hits a ball for our entertainment. That's not a hero. That's not what that word means. It's better said for two gentlemen that sit on stage tonight that answered the call to their nation. They served their country, and they rid the world of the worst tyranny that humankind has ever seen. If you want to know what a hero is, it's those two gentlemen right over there. And I want to thank you very much for being here. And a great thanks to Ian Toll. Came a long way from New York City. It's been a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you up at the foyer.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.